Marvel Snap may have finally made a card that is A, good, and B, has the word Horseman in its name. Storm Horseman of War is a 3/1 with an objective ability that checks if you have ended 2 consecutive turns with unspent energy. If you have, she buffs all of the units at her location on your side of the board and your hand by +2 power. This is a really interesting design space because it puts her both into buff decks and into high evolutionary Star-Lord style skip energy decks. It also means that decks that involve her tend to have some amount of payoff for both halves of these strategies, which is a really interesting spot for a card to be in. The upshot of this is that her baseline power is actually pretty high, but it ends up being dependent on these other cards as well. She is not a threat that is winning you the game on her own. She is a card that is intensifying the game-winning abilities of your other cards. But she's also, in that way, a card that you build around in a very clear and straightforward way. So let's talk about a couple of decks for Storm Horseman of Famine, and then we'll talk about an overall review. It's a little bit odd to talk about Storm Horseman of Famine specifically because there are a couple of cards that are impacting her pretty strongly right now, and one of them just came out about a couple hours before I recorded this video, and the other one they announced that they're nerfing. So it's interesting to talk about these decks, but when we do, please keep in mind, the Mother Askani stuff, very preliminary, and Star-Lord, of course, they did announce they are going to make him weaker in the OTA tomorrow. So, with that in mind, we're going to start with a Mother Askani deck because I'm not exactly sure what decks that rely on Star-Lord will look like with Storm Horseman of Famine. The Mother Askani deck is using Storm as a secondary intensifier. The goal here is get the Storm buff down, and we basically free roll the Storm buff by skipping turn 1 and playing a 1-drop on turn 2. With a deck like this, that's kind of how we want to play the game anyway, so we're really not losing out on much. This list comes from Heart of the Cards, and it was my most successful Storm deck that I've played full stop. A lot of the other Storm decks felt like they ran into problems with not necessarily having the right balance of points and interaction, but the combination of Storm and Mother Askani in what I guess you might call the Silver Surfer shell, even though Surfer isn't in there, I mean, like, you could take the else out and play Surfer, that's a very acceptable thing to do, feel free to do that, is still going to be something that actually kind of makes sense. And this is a list that is basically built around using the buff on a Captain Carter and intensifying that buff in the form of Maverick and using Mother Askani to take the Storm buff and multiply it further. That's really sort of the ethos of the deck. You're using Mother Askani to get a Captain Carter on a Captain Carter, or a Maverick on a Maverick, or 2 Captain Carters that are very big to win 2 separate lanes. Speaking of Captain Carter, I kind of think she's the most important card in this deck, in that she is really your biggest win condition. You get a Captain Carter down, you get the Maverick behind the Captain Carter, you brood a lane, and you are just going to be okay. That is like the baseline win condition here. There's a bunch of weirder and more finicky things you can do, but a lot of what this deck does that is successful is Captain Carter and Maverick related. Now, you can also do things like play Mother Askani, Grandmaster the Mother Askani, get 3 copies of something. I've had games where I've played 3 Captain Carters. One was 4, 2 were 6, and cost 1. That kind of stuff is very, very strong as well. I do think that it's important to judge this in the context that it releases in. Mother Askani is a big buff to this kind of deck. I played several versions of this that were doing non-Mother Askani type stuff in a surfer-ish kind of shell, and none of them felt as good as the Mother Askani stuff. It felt like it was very reliant on getting the Storm buff, but now, between Storm and Askani, we have multiple ways of getting this this buff. I do think that long term, I'm likely to take a hard look at replacing Elsa Bloodstone with a Silver Surfer, so that if we have to play out these cards earlier, we can still back buff a lane and reverse engineer like a pretty big Maverick. Like if we have to reverse engineer the Maverick, it's getting a Captain Carter buff, it's getting the Surfer buff. It'll at least get to like 8 power. That's enough to make a Brood pretty prohibitively large and still win a lane. We're gonna be okay as long as we do that. That kind of thing seems like pretty appealing to me. Being able to back buff those lanes on your bad draws seems like something that I would like to get into this deck, but largely the real thing that this deck does that I think is pretty compelling is compound Storm with Mother Askani with these other targets that it has access to. The biggest thing here is taking a buff and making that buff double itself up. That's the goal. An example of a deck I did not have a lot of success with, but some others did, is this one from Ika. I had some real issues with just being mostly a points deck and not a wonderfully good Cosmo deck. When you are able to be a good Prio deck with Viv Vision and Cosmo, it can be a really beneficial experience. Like Viv Vision here is sort of performing the role that Mother Askani was in the previous one, and to be clear, he made this before Mother Askani came out. This is all stuff I played last night, except for the first one, so there is some like give and take here, but largely my experience with this was it was very much I am doing a pretty finite number of points, and one of the things that makes mid-range decks to me successful right now is that they're doing finite numbers of points with a lot of useful interaction. This felt a lot like maybe playing the Aurora deck, but without the level of surprise that Aurora gives. It does do really powerful stuff, though. Like, you can snap on Sholau gamers if you're drawing your good cards. Like, the power that this deck has when it is able to roll downhill and compound what it's trying to do is really strong. It's just notably, and I think this is going to be true of a lot of Storm Horseman decks, a lot of locations are weirdly bad for you in ways that they are not for other things, because your basic entire game plan is, I am going to play a lot of cards that are extremely, exceedingly powerful if I pull off this specific ordering mechanic. And so any kind of location that makes it more difficult to pull off the ordering mechanic, like anything that is restricting you from playing there, anything that is like adding another turn to the game, you're not really built for that. Anything that is changing the way in which you are able to play your cards, anything that is dragging a card from your hand to the board, all of that stuff, your cards are way better when you play them than when they show up on the board. I was struck by how many bad locations there were for just decks like this. Here is where we get into a bit of weirdness. Now, Marvel Snap has already announced that they are going to weaken Star-Lord, Master of the Sun, in the upcoming OTA. They announced this because there is a $50 bundle featuring Star-Lord, Master of the Sun, and they didn't want people to purchase it without knowing that they're going to weaken the card that they're purchasing. And I think that's a smart thing to do. That's the correct, like, moral, ethical thing to do. I mean, I suppose the correct thing to do would be to not have that bundle here and notice it earlier so you don't have to do this. But in the situation they were in, I do think they deserve kudos for telling us, hey, we're going to nerf Star-Lord. It's weird, especially, though, because Star-Lord and Storm have the same inputs. Ending turns without spending all your energy is an input for Storm, and it's an input for Star-Lord. So telling us that they're going to nerf Star-Lord, that's good. But we don't know how much they're going to nerf Star-Lord. Am I still going to be able to play this deck in a day or two? Is that going to be a thing that I can do? Will it be nearly as good as what it is right now? And I don't think I can do a video where I talk about this deck without telling you that, like, this might not even be a thing, depending on what they do to Star-Lord. I have no idea what they're going to do. I see a lot of the speculation in the community is basically like, they're just going to take 1 point off of it, and then it's not going to really matter. And if they do that, I think there is no risk to this deck. But, like, let's say they do something more than that, then there is a risk to this deck, and I want you to consider that, because the reason I do these videos fundamentally is so I can talk about new and exciting cards, but I know people occasionally watch them and they're like, okay, well, I saw this really cool deck, I'm going to go get Storm. And I have to talk about this because if this is the deck that's making you go get Storm, I would say you should wait a day before you make that decision. Like, this is the kind of, like, we know for a fact. Normally, I advise nobody buy anything the week of OTAs, but like, when we know for a fact that one of the cards on which this deck is predicated, to the degree that there is a blink in here to go get it and make it more consistently applicable, we gotta talk about it. So with that out of the way, this is, I think, probably the strongest non-Mother Askani version of Storm that I've seen. The fact is that you are almost certainly going to get a Star-Lord for at least 3. You skip on turn 1 and turn 2. On turn 3, you play a 3. On 4, you play a 3. Then you play Star-Lord, or you blink that 3 for a Star-Lord, and boom. You are looking at a 9 energy final turn. Star-Lord is basically Big Sarah. That's a perfectly viable method for a deck like this to exist. But when you're playing Big Sarah and it's 12 power, if that card gets nerfed, well, suddenly it's actually not nearly as good of a deck, isn't it? That said, this deck is a much less like super finicky kind of version of this archetype. Like, you're much less a Captain Carter, Maverick, let me order all this stuff correctly kind of deck, and much more a Sarah Surfer deck. That's fundamentally what this deck is. This is 2026 Sarah Surfer. You have these interactive tools, which I do like, being able to be a Shadow King deck. I'm a big fan of being able to be a Killmonger deck, but I think this has a lot of the same problems and issues that a Sarah Surfer deck does, which is this output going to be enough? What happens when your interaction is the interaction that the metagame needs you to have? All of that stuff is notable. And I think that this is the kind of deck where it's like, yeah, this feels very reasonable day one, but I do wonder if it ends up being much more about whether or not the interaction this deck gets to play can line up with the meta, and much less about anything else. And I do think that if in a world where people are playing Mother Askani, in a world where people are playing a lot of like, you know, I'm going to buff a bunch of stuff, if we're playing buff slop, being the buff slop deck that plays Shadow King is a really interesting space to be. Maybe we end up cutting the Killmonger for Mobius to more hard target those mirrors, and because Mobius works against Mother Askani, but Mobius does not work against Star-Lord, which is another notable upside of Star-Lord being Big Sarah in this way. But functionally, the gameplay loop is a Sarah Surfer gameplay loop. You play nothing on turn 1, you play nothing on turn 2, you play a 3-on-3, a 3-on-4, and then you play your 5, and then you play 3 3s on the final turn of the game. That's what you do. That's the deck. And it is a very straightforward, very acceptable deck that I think will be largely defined by how well its tech matches up into the matchups that it is expecting to see. Because Star-Lord and, of course, Storm have the same incentives, we do have to talk a little bit about the Evo thing. I will say, as an Evo deck, I felt like a lot of the strength of the Evo deck was being able to be a bit of a tech deck. Like, to be completely honest with you, in Evo, I felt like I preferred the Polaris build to this build, which comes from Zombies Go Nom Nom, which is not to say that Polaris is a better card than Storm, just that I felt of the two builds, the Polaris build was doing things that I liked more. The Shang-Chi, the Red Guardian, the points being a little bit unexpected, the ability to interact with your opponent via making their things smaller. It's particularly relevant to be a kind of affliction-based high Evo deck in a world where a lot of people are doing buff slop. You can really actually interact with them that way. Like, Scorpion's amazing against the people who are playing Storm, right? Like, this kind of stuff is notable, and going away from that to become more of a floaty, She-Hulky type of high Evo deck that doesn't have the same depth of tech, that is a little bit problematic. And I do think that, like, it's not necessarily an indictment on Storm that I prefer the techie version. I'm me. Of course I prefer the techie version. Have you met me ever in your life? But I do think that there may be a middle ground that can be approached with high Evo that does make a lot of sense. Of course, I have to say the same thing as I said on the previous section. They are nerfing Star-Lord, and we don't know what that looks like. And these decks, to a greater or lesser degree, they are Star-Lord decks. And they may not be only Star-Lord decks. The previous deck, that's a Star-Lord deck. It's about Star-Lord. This deck maybe can survive, but I don't necessarily know that it would want to. And I think that that kind of thing is really worth pointing out here. This is a card that has the exact same incentives as the card that is on sale right as they are nerfing Star-Lord. That's a really unfortunate situation for them to be in, and I wish they had been able to avoid it. Overall, I think that Storm feels solid. I like what she is bringing to her archetype. The biggest thing that I can tell you about how I feel about her archetypes, though, is that they feel a little bit unfocused. The Mother Askani one definitely feels the best, and I think that that might be because Mother Askani might be really good. There's an OTA tomorrow, and then we'll do decks on Friday, and then Mother Askani's review will probably be on Saturday, but I would expect me to say that she's like a pretty good card. And I think that she naturally works pretty well with Storm, so maybe it's one of those things that as we lose a card that works well with Storm, Star-Lord, we gain a card that works well with Storm, Mother Askani. I can very easily see us going into like a Storm Mother Askani meta. My worry is that will be a lot more about Mother Askani and a lot less about Storm. I think she's a natural fit in those decks, but not necessarily the world's strongest card in that context. I've generally enjoyed her, and I do like that she's an objective, because if she was an on-reveal, she'd be one of the most irredeemably busted cards on the entire planet. Well balanced here. I think that this is a card that is very much worth keeping an eye on. I would advise you, if you're worried about purchasing it, take a look as to how things are shaking out towards the end of the OTA. Take a look as to where she's going to end up and see if you have cards like Captain Carter and Maverick that I think are going to be really important to what her good decks look to be. My instinct is that's the direction that this card is going to take long term. Captain Carter, Maverick-y, stack a bunch of buffs kind of things. The question is really mainly, is it going to be good enough to be better at those things than Sholau? And what interaction is it going to be able to play to stop things from going over the top of it? The best solution I've found to that so far is the Heart of the Cards deck. Obviously, we need more time to be able to answer questions like that, but the more you think the answer to those questions is going to be yes, the better this card is going to get. I can see this card legitimately becoming a very important metagame player, depending on what happens in the OTA tomorrow. And even if nothing changed, I think the Mother Askani stuff does feel pretty compelling to me in this space, because you use the Storm, then Mother Askani effectively multiplies the effectiveness of the Storm's buff. That's a really powerful thing to do, and if you have a card that is multiplying that effectiveness in and of itself, a Captain Carter, a Maverick, well, I mean, you're just home free at that point. All right, y'all, thank you so much for watching. As always, I have been KMBest. You have been phenomenal. Remember to like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.